The 18th century, colonial times in America, was a fascinating time for cooking. While most people didn't yet have their own ovens and often had to improvise other methods, many people actually had a pretty decent knowledge of various cooking methods and would use as complicated a spicing regimen as their means would allow. Cooking would actually become less complex for a time during the Industrial Revolution years later, when people had even less means and less time to cook complex meals. Today, we are seeing a return of increasingly complex cooking along with much more advanced tools to do so. Number 10. Cooking puddings in cloth bags was actually an incredibly common practice. Today, it is really easy for someone with no real skill or training to at least heat up some food and make something somewhat edible. In fact, most people today have the convenience of a microwave, something people from the 18th century would really have no concept of. However, back then, some people didn't even have 18th century ovens, and so they had to improvise. One of the strangest but quite popular techniques was the method of cooking food in cloth bags. The bag would actually be cloth of the right thickness and would be boiled in water in order to sterilize it. The bag would often be floured or buttered so the pudding could come out later and then would be filled with the ingredients, wrapped up and boiled for hours. The second pot was usually used to keep extra water boiling so that you could keep the main pot full at all times. This was important as larger puddings could take 7 or more hours to cook using this method. Number 9. Food preservation methods were one of the most important things to know. In the 18th century, they of course did not have refrigerators or freezers, and preserving food was very difficult. Some of the very rich could ship in ice if they wanted to and preserve certain food, but even amongst the rich, this was so expensive that it was only for the occasional treat. For this reason, there are many different recipes from that time that involve pickling, drying, and other interesting methods in order to keep the food good as long as possible. The YouTube channel TopTenz, which tries out and demonstrates authentic recipes from the 18th century, has tried many different food preservation methods from this time period. While many of them are effective for preserving everything from strawberries to eggs to potted meat, the usual expected hold time in the time period was still usually only a few weeks or a couple of months at most. Even putting something down in the coldest part of the cellar would only keep the temperature down so much, and they didn't have perfect canning methods, so the average family didn't expect preserved goods to stay good for very long. Number 8. Nutmeg was one of the most popular spices and shows up in almost everything. Nutmeg is a spice that most people really don't think that much of today. It is one of many ingredients that often show up in things that have pumpkin in their name, and it is said that if you use a whole lot at once, you can get a delirious high. Some people see it show up a lot in 18th century recipes and wonder if people were trying to do drugs, but the truth is simply that it was a fad and people wanted to show their status by putting it in everything that they could afford to. However, because demand was so great, that meant fraudsters had a chance to step in. There was a real problem during the 18th century in colonial America of dishonest traders making wooden nutmegs and selling them to unsuspecting consumers, who would later realize they had been had for a pretty decent amount of money. Number 7. In the 18th century, people had a taste for flavors like rosewater that we would find rather odd. For those who don't know what it is, rosewater is pretty much what it sounds like, a water that is created by steeping rose petals. This fragrant essence is something that most people would expect in perfumes, but it is still used in Indian and Middle Eastern cuisine today, and it is even commonly used as a flavor in Turkish delights. However, it has fallen almost completely out of favor in Western cuisine. Apart from an occasional mention on some kind of fancy baking show by someone who is played up as taking a risk, you never really hear about these kind of floral flavors anymore. However, back in the day, floral flavors, and rosewater especially, were quite common in baked goods and sometimes other cooking as well. For those who wonder why it disappeared, it wasn't so much because people lost their taste for it, but because bakers started replacing it with what they found to be a better ingredient for bringing out flavors, and that's vanilla. Vanilla became the ingredient of choice in the 19th century as it became easier to acquire, and with artificial substitutes like vanillin that people can get for very cheap, vanilla is unlikely to be dethroned anytime soon. Number 6. Suet, the hard white fat from kidneys, was a staple of 18th century cooking. Suet is a white fat that can be found on the kidneys of various livestock animals, and it has a hard texture that cooks found great for holding together puddings. The reason is because due to its crumbly texture when prepared for cooking and its high melting point, it maintains its texture through a very long cooking process, essentially being the last part to finish cooking on the inside. The main point of using suet was to help puddings to be a little more airy instead of just a dense ball of flour, water, and other such ingredients. Today, people don't really cook stuff in pudding bags anymore, and so so we tend to use other fats or oils instead. However, if you want to recreate an old 18th century recipe, there are still some ways to get your hands on suet. If you live in the United Kingdom, you are especially lucky, as some traditional recipes still use it, so you can still find it in some stores. However, if you live in the United States, you're probably going to have to order it online. Number 5. Enslaved cooks were incredibly skilled and brought knowledge to the enslaved community. In the 18th century in America, the vast majority of black people were still enslaved and forced to use all of their considerable skills for no pay. Many people tend to just think of them as field hands, but history often hides or doesn't bother to highlight just how important the jobs given to enslaved individuals were. One of the most important of these jobs, according to food historian Michael Twitty, was being an enslaved cook. He has appeared on that channel we mentioned previously, TopTenz, to briefly go over some of the food of the enslaved for a couple of episodes. He explains that the enslaved cooks became a valuable source of knowledge and skill that their masters came to rely on, but also an incredibly valuable resource for the rest of the enslaved community. They could take back knowledge about cooking that allowed the community to make the best of every ingredient that they had. They could pass on knowledge about literacy and about anything else of note that they had picked up. Many people were also unaware that enslaved black cooks basically created American barbecue and perfected it during the colonial times. Number 4. Seasonal and regional food were all people had, so they had to learn to get creative. We have it remarkably easy as a society when it comes to food. We can pretty much get anything we want at any time. But in the 18th century, they had to really just make do with whatever they had the most of at the time. We did mention food preservation earlier, but as we said, many methods were really only to keep the food long enough for the family to use it before it went bad, and not for long-term storage. Even things that were relatively long-lasting might not seem that long to us today. This meant that wherever you lived, whatever was seasonal was what you had to work with. Of course, this wasn't unique to the 18th century, and it was true for pretty much every other time period before the Industrial Revolution and mass transportation, as well as refrigeration and freezing technology. Back in the day, none of that was a reality, and even the richest people would only occasionally ship something in. For the most part, even the well-off just stuck to whatever was fresh and local in the region at the time of year. Number 3. Cheesecakes that had no cheese were common in 18th century cookbooks. Today we tend to think of cheesecake as a concoction of cream cheese, eggs, sugar, and flavorings. Of course, while cream cheese is modern, that doesn't mean cheesecakes are an entirely modern invention. There is evidence that cheesecakes using ricotta cottage cheese, mascarpone, and others have existed long before cream cheese was ever a thing. However, in the 18th century in America and Western Europe, if you ordered a cheesecake, you would probably find yourself rather disappointed. There are quite a few recipes that pop up in 18th century cookbooks that call themselves a cheesecake, some using various flavors such as lemon, but the one thing they all lack is any cheese. As far as those who study the cookbooks of the 18th century can surmise, these were called cheesecakes because they were made to have the consistency and texture of cheese, and were also usually made in a pie-like dish and kind of resembled a cheese wheel. These dishes were certainly delicious in their own right, but we would be quite shocked at being served such a cheesecake in most places in the world today. Number 2. Raisins and other dried fruits and nuts were considered luxurious additions to desserts. Today you will often hear the common refrain, especially among children, that they really don't like nuts in their confections or sweets, whether they be a candy bar or a cake. Even a lot of adults will turn their nose up at a sweet with nuts in it, and most people don't even try to bake raisins or other fruits into anything besides cinnamon raisin bread. As far as most people are concerned, especially in the USA, fruit and nuts in confections is usually blasphemy, and fruitcake is at the top of the list. However, back in the 18th century, they would think you were crazy for passing up such a delicious, decadent, rich man's treat that people could generally only afford every once in a while. During the holidays, people were being extravagant and stuffing their desserts with what was to them the best toppings, while today many people act as if eating such a food would be actual torture. People's tastes and their desires for certain flavors and textures has certainly changed a lot since the 18th century. Number 1. Eggs appear in a ridiculous amount of recipes and form the backbone of regular cooking. Today, eggs are still one of the most common forms of food we eat, but they are the subject of hot debate. Researchers keep telling us whether they are good for us or not, and how many we should have a day. However, back in the 18th century, they were one of the most important food staples imaginable, and pretty much everyone had access to eggs of some kind. People in the past ate them like we do today, that eat them plain and also add spices to them. To some, this may seem like a no-brainer. Eggs have made up the backbone of baking for an incredibly long time due to their leavening abilities and their binding properties. The high protein and fat content in a small package has always made it a staple for anyone looking to survive outside of the days in the modern grocery store. And while hens may not lay as many eggs in the winter, they do not stop production entirely, which gave some poorer families a near constant food source. Having a few chickens was also a lot more affordable than raising and eating other animals. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, give us a thumbs up below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you're looking for something else to watch, why not check out one of the videos from the archives, linked to on the screen now. And as always, thank you for watching.